Thank you very much. I scripted myself so I'd stay on time. I'm a biologist, and I started my work out in marine mammals and marine invertebrates, and thought that for some crazy reason I would move into horses. But my background is working primarily with federal and state agencies on the little guys. But I'm currently the biologist for Return to Freedom. We're a wild horse advocacy organization with about 450 wild horses and burros on 4 different sort of satellite facilities. We do education and outreach at our facilities and try to get people involved in sort of the larger issue of management of these animals on public lands and the complexities behind that issue. I also work in that sort of science guiding policy arena, so that's being pushy a lot. And because we're a closed system and we have alleyways and chutes and we know all of our animals very well, we're able to draw blood or perform necropsies, collect hair and blood samples, things like that. So we've been able to sort of provide data for the greater good in some larger scale long-term research projects. We've also been using the immune contraceptive vaccine PZP at our sanctuary facility since 1999. So it's nice to sort of be able to bring that experience, not trying to say that our experience is exactly as it would be in the wild at all, but it does give us sort of a little bit of a background to understand what's feasible and what's not. So what follows is the story of public lands, competing interests, a changing climate, and quite frankly, learning to love and understand people who are completely opposite of what you might be thinking. All right, how am I advancing this slide?
Just use the toggle on the right.
I don't see a toggle on the right, sorry.
It's got a T on it.
See if the space bar will work. There you go.
That's much better, thank you. We have wild horses and burros in 10 western United States. 55 million years ago, horses began their evolutionary journey right here in what is now the United States, first as Eohippus, and over many millions of years, they adapted and evolved to changing conditions, of course, and they migrated all around the globe with the exception of the poles and Australia. They moved back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge, or what was the Bering Land Bridge, many times, but 10 to 12,000 years ago, they became extinct, along with a lot of other large land mammals. I'm sure I don't have to tell you all here at this conference, from North America. Mustang is from the Spanish word mustaño, which loosely translated means horse without a home. Horses returned to the North American continent in the 1500s, first with Spanish explorers and soon after with European explorers. These horses were released or escaped and intermixed and repopulated the land, and these are the ancestors of today's wild horses, those horses that we refer to as mustangs. There's a lot of background surrounding what must be considered when managing wild horses and burros on public lands. In early United States government efforts to expand Euro-American populations westward, applicants could acquire ownership of government land or the public domain. For clearing the land, improving it, and living on it for 5 years, a modest fee allowed legal ownership of a 160-acre tract. And where did people go to settle in these dry western lands? They went to water. That comes into play much later, probably with Dr. Perryman's part of the story here. As more and more people moved west, they grazed their cattle and sheep, and invariably arguments broke out about who got to graze where and for how long. The rule of law was essentially that there was no rule of law, and in 1935, the Taylor Grazing Act ended open grazing on public land and established the Division of Grazing in the Department of the Interior. That would eventually become the Bureau of Land Management. In the 1950s, a woman named Velma Johnston, who would later be known as Wild Horse Annie, grew curious about a truckload of animals traveling down a road with blood dripping from the back of the truck. She followed it, and what were offloaded were horses at a slaughter facility. She went to work figuring out where those horses came from and who was responsible for them, and essentially found that unwanted horses on private or public lands could be disposed of in any manner anyone wanted. They could be gathered for ranch work, shot, or shipped to slaughter. She began campaigning for more humane treatment of these animals, and in 1959, the Wild Horse Annie Act prohibited the use of motorized vehicles to hunt wild horses and burros. Her work continued, towards federal protection for horses and burros, and in 1971, with a huge amount of public support, the Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act was passed and conveyed the management and protection of wild horses and burros on public lands to the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. They were to be managed as, quote, an integral part of the natural system of the public lands. Euthanasia and sales without restriction were allowed in the act. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, as amended, is the Bureau of Land Management's Organic Act that established the agency's multiple use and sustained yield mandate to serve present and future generations. That's a quote. And the Public Rangelands Improvement Act required the Secretary of the Interior to maintain a continuing inventory of rangeland conditions and trends in 16 western states, and specifically called out the maintenance of horses and burros at an appropriate management level, or AML. And it says so within that act. The purpose of such inventory shall be to make determinations as to whether and where an overpopulation exists and whether action should be taken to remove excess animals, determine appropriate management levels of wild free-roaming horses and burros on these areas of the public lands, and determine whether appropriate management levels should be achieved by the removal or destruction of excess animals. But in 1981 and 1982, the Bureau of Land Management actually did euthanize 47 excess animals, and the public outcry was tremendous. And that led then BLM Director Robert Bierford to ban the destruction of healthy wild horses and burros for the purposes of management. So, you can see that a host of acts and policies hover over this management of wild horses and burros, and I didn't even touch on anything. We have the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Act that also affect management options for these animals. So various natural resource agencies have varying tasks and oversight and responsibilities for and on different parts of our public lands. Wild horses and burros exist on lands administered by each of these agencies, but it is the Bureau of Land Management, which is the battleship, as it were, of wild horse and burro management agencies. They have the most animals on the most land to manage, and they have a budget specific for that management. BLM is mandated to manage and protect these animals on BLM land and to work with other agencies to do so on their land. Unsurprisingly to some of you, these agencies don't always play well together. There are 177 herd management areas of various sizes on BLM land where wild horses and burros are present and managed today, and in each of those areas an appropriate management level is determined. And this is the number of horses and burros that can be sustained alongside the other multiple uses happening on that same land. And that's also going to have to do with soil type, water availability, climate, and habitat type. When numbers of horses exceed the appropriate management level determined for that herd management area, they are considered excess, and however many are above the appropriate management level are rounded up, usually via helicopter, processed and separated by sex at a short-term holding facility, and either adopted or eventually make their way to long-term pasture. 3 to 5 years later, your population on that particular herd management area has risen again, and so you must repeat the entire process. This goes on across each of the 177 herd management areas forever. You're essentially chasing your tail. Finally, we have multiple competing stakeholders. Stakeholder concerns, as much as I think a lot of us resist, matter. Incorporating public attitudes into wild equid management decisions was suggested as important by the National Research Council in 1982, when they noted that public opinion was, quote, a major motivation behind the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Program and a primary criterion to management success. I have 3 minutes. But wicked problems describe planning and social policy issues that are difficult to frame and not so straightforward in their solutions. Management of wild horses and burros most certainly constitutes a wicked problem. But we have a huge matter of public trust when it comes to this issue. Gathering and removing over and over doesn't instill a lot of confidence in your stakeholders. This is incredibly expensive, and costs only can go up if everything around this program is also growing, populations both on and off range. Placing animals into holding facilities is not ideal. People don't like that as a situation for animals. They're expensive. They're not endlessly available. Ranchers grow frustrated when horse numbers are above appropriate management levels. They don't understand why the agencies cannot gather those excess animals immediately. Wildlife biologists and conservationists feel their concerns are not listened to at all, that livestock grazing and overpopulated horses degrade the ecosystems wildlife rely upon. And wild horse advocates feel that the protections afforded to the horses and burros under the 1971 Act have been eroded and that all other uses get priority. Then there are sensational stories that come out from time to time. In 1997, there was a headline in the Associated Press which said 32,000 adopted horses and burros are missing in action at the BLM. And in 2012, ProPublica published an article about a man named Tom Davis, who between 2009 and 2012 adopted 1,749 BLM horses that neither he nor the BLM could account for where they ended up. And in fact, in 2015, a report from the Interior Department's Office of Inspector General described how the horses Davis acquired did indeed end up at slaughter. And in 2021, a New York Times article described how horses that were adopted through the BLM's adoptive incentive program and were effectively flipped, with owners receiving title, their $1,000 cash as an incentive, and selling that horse at a sales barn literally days after receiving title. And in 2022, 145 horses at the BLM holding facility in Canyon City, Colorado, died essentially of disease and short staffing issues in a nutshell. Ultimately, for the public to trust government organizations, a fair back and forth must be perceived between stakeholders and the government agencies involved, and importantly, between stakeholders and each other. Reasons decisions are made, especially when the tricky expectation of fair, ecologically sensitive multiple use comes into play, must be clear and transparent. The next handful of panelists that you're going to see are going to cover some of these issues, including how we meaningfully engage with stakeholders, concerns for the high desert and sagebrush steppe ecosystems wild horses and burros reside upon, and fertility control methodologies that may offer compromise to the wicked problem of managing wild horses and burros on fragile Western landscapes. Thank you.